I am deeply, deeply honored to introduce the eminent educational theorist and psychoanalyst Deborah Britzman, whose work has profoundly influenced me over the past 20 years in my capacity as researcher, teacher, and administrator. In that latest role, it has been illuminating and sobering exercise to read Britzman's article on the fragility of peace, which many of you read for the seminar this morning, ahead of conversations that have been happening here at McMaster as they are happening across Canada on the role that universities will play in advancing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. And in light of universities in North America and Europe having to respond in the immediacy of the moment to the Syrian refugee crisis, spurred by a region racked by decades of warfare. These are just two examples of historic and contemporary tragedies in which educational institutions have surely played their role, a recognition and a reckoning that needs to inform meaningful response. Like the French theorist Michel Foucault, Britzman has long recognized the fallacy at the very heart of the Western organization of thought. The idea, as he put it, that, quote, knowledge and truth can never not belong to the register of order and peace, that knowledge and truth can never be found on the side of violence, disorder, and war. Or as Britzman herself states, with an analyst's characteristic incisiveness, of the possible arrangement of, quote, psychosocial life capable of unspeakable involvement in an educational enterprise dedicated to genocide. Britzman describes the particular crises universities now face in terms of what she calls the very thought of education and the affective dimensions of education, which determine when the confrontation with a harsh or unyielding reality ushers in either the need to think or, in fact, it destroys thinking itself. For her, evidence of the waning status of universities and of teachers in them and outside of them in public schools is linked to what she calls the decline of enlightenment as a metaphor for education, which has resulted from an intense, accelerated, and revolutionary transformations associated with post-industrial, postmodern societies. With her inimitable capacity for identifying human contradiction and paradox, Britzman focuses our attention on what she calls the horror of learning for both teachers and students. It is one of the tragedies of our time, she suggests, that our conception of education has been so scaled back, so denigrated and demoted to children's activity, as if adults are no longer themselves to be burdened with how to live in the world with others. And so the task of learning anew returns us anew to the pain and anxiety we recall with regard to our own intellectual development within educational institutions. She recalls these with us, evincing the terrifying encounter with the unknown and the obscure, the indignities of being disciplined, the disgrace of occasional failure, the myriad disappointments and narcissistic injuries. In conditions marked by postmodernity, the horror of learning is effectively suppressed by, she writes, skills supplanting ideas, technique is confused with authority and responsibility, and know-how short-circuits the existential questions of indeterminacy and incompleteness, unquote. Such are the fruits of what Bill Reddings might have called neoliberalism's university of innovation, for what Deborah says is the high-speed student turned consumer. In substituting training for higher learning, the university performs what Britzman calls the collapse of its pedagogical theme. It remains as a ruin, marking the place where a critical function of education has become obsolete. The seduction of certainty in times of acute vulnerability and dependence proves too great to refuse. As a result, the default position of too many in the academy is to close ranks and resist change at any level. And in refusing the uncertainty of new knowledge, or the very conditions that produce new knowledge and new relations, we refuse, in Britzman's terms, quote, the emotional acceptance of our ignorance because we cannot really know what will happen with new knowledge, that even new knowledge does not exhaust what is unknowable, and that we act from not understanding. This is the lesson of Arendt and Adorno, who, in their reflections on mid-century European catastrophe, understood too well what happens when humans, by their own actions, destroy the capacity to think and therefore act humanely. One of the many challenges of our time will be learning how to learn again and to employ the public use of reason and interests in the interests of composing counter-conceptions of current social arrangements, their conditions of possibility and impossibility. And that requires learning how to embrace doubt and how to take responsibility for the outcomes, for the unknown outcomes of what we do, rather than exchange this intolerable vulnerability for the forms of instrumental rationality and the terrible destruction they inevitably unleash on one hand, or for forms of intellectual paralysis on the other. Given human injustice and equality suffered just beyond its walls, the university and its resident intellectuals, teachers and students among them, need to reclaim the public character and commitment of the institution to public life. Britzman's body of work compels faculty, administrators, and students collectively to assume the awesome responsibility to think for the mutual benefit of their own humanity and the lives and dignity of others. Deborah Britzman is Distinguished Research Professor at York University in Toronto, Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and practicing psychoanalyst. Internationally known for her research and education in psychoanalysis, Britzman is the author of 8 books and over 90 articles. Her 2 recent books, of Psychoanalyst in the Classroom, Education as Human Condition, and Melanie Klein, Early Analysis, Play, and the Question of Freedom, is forthcoming. Britzman is the 2015 recipient of the Hans Lowell Memorial Award for the International Forum for Psychoanalytic Education. So let me and all of us welcome her to the podium.
I want to thank Professor Giroux and to say hello. I'm really happy to be here, and I want to thank you for this wonderful invitation. Today I'll be working from the Klein book, and the topic that, it's probably an optimistic topic that I'm giving you today, and it's on the topic of psychoanalytic friendship, and narratives of a psychoanalytic situation on the friendship of Mrs. K. It was how she referred to herself in her book about this case study. It's one of the most extensive cases that we have in child analysis, and Richard. That's the book that I'm working with, and now we'll move to the third slide. So the span of the paper is from 1941 to 1989. I'll give you a little bit of an introduction. We'll call it Nachträglichkeit, or some sort of deferred action. The next section is a quote, go right to the depths. The third section, do you really know what I think? How can you know? This is the 24th session with Richard and Melanie Klein. Then, do psychoanalysts go to church? That's the 52nd session. And then, must we say goodbye on the sadness of parting? And then a little postscript on Richard, Mrs. Klein, and Mahler. Just at the beginning of the start of the Freud-Klein controversies in the midst of World War II, Mrs. Klein, then 59 years old, conducted a 4-month analysis with Richard, a 10-year-old English boy. From the beginning, Richard knew they would only have 4 months together and that Mrs. Klein would have to end the analysis. Perhaps such knowledge confirmed his suspicions, and there were many: Mrs. Klein's thick German accent, the visible and invisible enemies, and the improbability of friendship. The transference was immediate. The year was 1941, particularly difficult for them both. And in one of those strange psychoanalytic coincidences, the analysand's anguish was not very far away from that of the analyst. Klein, too, must have been preoccupied with enemies who were suspicious of her theories. She was in preparation for her defense to the British psychoanalytic controversial discussions. Her August 29, 1941 letter to Clifford Scott forecast heartache, and she mentions Richard. Quote, "We are only at the beginning of making people understand the importance and meaning of depression, and I'm afraid it will be a difficult and lengthy job. I now analyze a boy of 10. It is surprising and gratifying to see how much knowledge of the depressive position has advanced technique and theoretical practical understanding. I am afraid, however, that most of our colleagues are extremely reluctant to accept these new things. This may retard progress, but should not altogether hold it up." 19 years later, around the age of 76, Klein returned to her boxes of notes on an analysis cut short and wrote her most affecting study, Narrative of a Child Analysis, the Conduct of Psychoanalysis of Children as Seen Through the Treatment of a 10-Year-Old Boy. It was published posthumously in 1961. It runs 496 pages. She continued to justify her psychoanalytic technique with extensive footnotes, many of which anticipated long-standing contentions over her style of deep interpretation. By then, Klein had redefined the designs of psychoanalytic concepts such as projective identification, the paranoid schizoid and depressive position, envy and gratitude, the total situation of the transference, the centrality of fantasy to early anxiety situations, and the infantile roots of the adult mind. She continued to maintain that early analysis of young children was the royal road to knowledge in adult psychoanalysis. My discussion of Klein's late work attends to the fate, or perhaps the vicissitudes, of the good object, with the provocative claim that the heart of the psychoanalytic situation proposes to the analyst and the analysand a question of friendship. Such friendship is unlike any other. As appeal to fleeting scenes of appearance, disappearance, and the art of compromise, psychoanalytic friendship must bow to its own incompleteness. Now, while the field of psychoanalysis contains significant commentary and dispute over the analytic couple, the analytic relation, endings and beginnings, free association, and the significance of transference love, while Freud suggested that the analytic alliance is dedicated to the destruction of the symptom, and while the analyst's ethic of neutrality may serve as a warning to her unavoidable transference, what today is discussed as the analyst's self-disclosures, the hovering question of friendship is hardly discussed. With Klein, the question of friendship belongs to the fate of the good object. Her emphasis on the inner world of object relations as friendly and unfriendly, and as good and bad, opens new awareness for why the desire for friendship is so significant to the life world of the mind and the moral capacity for symbolizing the depressive position that keeps watch over feelings of loneliness, sadness, and gratitude and thoughts of the other. I also wish to place into the folds of psychoanalytic friendship the desire to write about our work, the style of listening made when we receive the words of others, and then, too, the attempt to sustain the desire for the human bond when there seems to be no friend. Derrida's Politics of Friendship, published in American Imago, proffers a meditation on friendship as thoughts of the other, quote, as something yet to come, quote, and as, quote, an experience in waiting, unquote. Such is the psychoanalytic situation. Before, during, and after the psychoanalytic situation, friendship may flourish from and founder over anxiety over the loss of love. As potential, the friendship yet to come faces the psychical difficulties of wanting, wishing, and waiting for an actual other who also suffers, yet still invests in the work of fantasy, the unconscious, imagination, interpretation, and the urge for reparation. What then does this psychoanalytic friendship propose? Simply the trace of transference proposes an exchange of moral quandaries, anxiety, and desire given over to the other. For Klein and Richard, their question of friendship is tied to the promise of the good object, as well as thoughts as to how easily it slips away. Klein's last book differed in three extraordinary ways from her 1932 study, The Psychoanalysis of Children, where she could only present early analysis through rapid brushstrokes and grand theoretical leaps. First, the narrative unfolds with literary devices such as first and third person voice, foreshadowing, defense, dialogue, personification, retroaction, and the illusion of first time. Footnotes serve as her conservative Greek chorus, while her index proposes the radical mashup of fantasies. Their apprenticeship in transference lit the flame for Klein's narrative liberties. There follows a second difference. Readers experience their strange volley of discordant words spoken to each other, their misunderstandings, and the confusion of unaccountable anxiety. The writing and reading of the case is itself an emotional situation. Klein hardly comments on the third difference. The narrative responded to one of the most difficult criticisms leveled at psychoanalysis generally, and Klein quite specifically. Many argue that her psychoanalytic theories and of object relations cares nothing for the force of the external world. Richard's analysis proved otherwise. It occurred within an extraordinarily urgent context, the frightening world at war, bombings, terrible suffering, displacement, destruction, death, and what seemed like endless waiting. In her introduction to the work, Klein notes that for the purposes of analysis and due to the London Blitz, Richard and his mother stayed during weekends in a hotel in a Welsh village. He took the bus to Klein's rented playroom there 5 to 6 days a week for their 50-minute sessions, and then on most weekends, when they could, they returned to their London homes. They met for 93 sessions. Klein begins with the key themes enacted in his play, quote, "The outbreak of the war had greatly increased Richard's difficulties. The war stirred up all his anxieties, and he was particularly frightened of air raids and bombs. He followed the news closely and took a great interest in the changes in the war situation, and this preoccupation came up again and again during the course of his analysis." The only war subject to symbolization, however, belonged to the psychoanalytic situation. Mrs. Klein was instructed by Richard striving to understand his own mind, and even as she accepted the fact that her theory tags along, to learn more, she had to break the rules of her own analytic comportment. 2 rules were broken. She answered Richard's questions and at times reassured him. Given her technique of needing to respond to what she called, quote, intangible factors and the most urgent aspects of the material, unquote, Klein's countertransference was inevitable. As the analysis proceeded, Richard begged for the work to continue. Even as Klein knew this was not to be, she gave him a faint hope. Perhaps she too held the wish for the fate of the good object, or even to become that good object breast for Richard's use. In session 65, Richard's anger towards Mrs. Klein came in the form of a monstrous portrait of her. Drawing 55 is titled Mrs. K. She is a triangle body with glaring eyes, gigantic breasts, a V on the stomach, hair on the head, and a line to the genitals, perhaps added as an afterthought. Then Richard, quote, picked up the drawing suddenly and put his lips to one breast, unquote. It is the only picture he would be embarrassed over, and one of the few times Mrs. Klein would try to appease his worries. Appeasement is the key term, and in a note on this session, Klein expressed what bothered her, quote, I have repeatedly remarked that in spite of not deviating from my technique, I sometimes answered questions which had the effect of reassuring Richard, which on the whole I depreciate, unquote. She then presents the dilemma. While Richard seemed relieved, his association said otherwise, and his doubts over Mrs. Klein's goodness was now displaced onto another scene. Klein writes, quote, his very next remark referred to a girl on the road who, though quite harmless in appearance, looked to him like a monster. Idealization of the analyst, the patriotic and not foreign and suspect Mrs. Klein had not resolved the doubts in her, but this doubt was deflected and transferred to the girl passing by. We can find again and again that mistakes of this kind are unconsciously, and with adults sometimes consciously, resented and criticized. And it is true in spite of patients longing to be loved and reassured. The next section is called Go Right to the Depths. Donald Meltzer's lectures on the narrative begin with the heart of Klein's technique. Quote, the first week of the analysis opens like a Chekhov play. Immediately, all the characters are introduced and all the themes and subplots are hinted at. What can be seen happening in the first week is that, intentionally or not, Mrs. Klein set about mobilizing anxieties rather than diminishing them. And the technique she employed for mobilizing Richard's anxieties is really no different from the one of diminishing them. That is, go right to the depths, unquote. Yet the depths of anxiety are murky. Love and hate, conflicted feelings of loneliness, envy, gratitude, and jealousy, persecutory fantasies of destruction and being destroyed, Oedipal conflicts, and a constellation of defenses that cue the denial of psychical reality. But Klein presents Richard as an articulate, intellectually gifted, and charming boy. At times he deploys his talents to manipulate others. He is both excessively polite and terribly worried. Richard becomes lost in his circuitous reasoning and then to bouts of paranoia, depression, and spectacular sadness. He is at war with his useless feelings. Around 1939, due to his fear of other children and his anger at being without friends, at the age of 8 he stopped going to school and his mother took over his education. His mother reported to Klein that Richard was anxious, overly affectionate, and worried about their separation. Then too, there were Richard's paranoid fears of being poisoned by the cook, of being watched by strangers, and his compulsion to be on guard. Whenever Mrs. Klein and Richard went outside, he required her to whisper. Everything was dangerous. The playroom too became a character world. It had a kitchen and lavatory, and Klein provided small toys, paper, pens, chalk, and a little table with 2 chairs. Klein would take his paintings home and then return them the next day. Occasionally, Richard would bring his own fleet of toy soldiers and warships. Leaving toys home meant a loss of trust in Klein. The rented playroom was used for other purposes, and for each session, Klein had to open the outside door. Much of the time, Richard arrived early and stood outside waiting for her. When the sessions ended, no matter how difficult, they walked away together. Richard would have the last words while Mrs. Klein kept her thoughts to herself. Interpretation of Richard's anxieties only occurred during the session. At their first meeting, Klein asked Richard if he knew why he was seeing her. He said he had some difficulties and wanted to be helped, and then he filled the room with his worries about Hitler's cruelty and about whether Mrs. Klein, like Hitler, was Austrian. He worried about boys and tramps who might hurt him. He worried he would be overheard by enemies. He was concerned over his mother's health and whether she would be kidnapped. And then something must have piqued Mrs. Klein's listening. Richard worried what he was like on the inside and what other people's insides were like. Through the characters of his mother, father, Mrs. K, Mr. K, the cook, terrible Hitler, and genitals and breasts, the first session belonged to persecutory objects. Everything stood in for something else. Mrs. Klein felt Richard's transference to her began as soon as he stepped into the room, and immediately she gave deep interpretations to his anxiety, explaining that his worries brought him to terrifying thoughts on parental coitus, father's violence, mother's helplessness, and Richard's guilt at wanting to have his mother all to himself. So much was happening, and in a footnote on that first session, written years later, Klein tips her hat to the chaos as well as the liberties of narration, quote, "But often I did not or could not record the fleeting effect the interpretations made on him. The child would seldom have been sitting silently while I was speaking. He might get up, pick up a toy or a pencil or pad. He might interject something which was a further association or doubt. Therefore, my interpretations may frequently appear more lengthy and consecutive than in fact they were." By the 40th session, and after a holiday where both Klein and Richard returned to London and its air raids, Richard's anxiety was palpable, as was his resistance to the work. Their separation had turned everything bad. Mrs. Klein described him that day as, quote, "a picture of unhappiness." He had difficulty settling, ran outside, stamped on poisonous weeds, and finally pulled from a shelf a book to read. His restlessness matched Klein's interpretation of that session, and it reads as brutal, quote, "Mrs. Klein interpreted that his silences and his reading expressed his wish to escape from his fears about the poisonous and dangerous father genital and the dead babies inside mummy, the toadstools and the nettles which he crushed under his feet. The playroom, the garden, and Mrs. K had turned bad and poisoned his mind. He wished to find out about Mrs. K's inside by looking in the book. This seemed less frightening than looking around in the playroom," unquote. And yet, after that session, Mrs. Klein and Richard walked side by side into the world. Klein made a long note on Richard's capacity to sustain a double attitude of both anxiety and hope. As if concerned about the readers of the case, Klein turned to her technique of addressing the urgency of anxiety situations, quote, "It seems striking that interpretations which are most painful, such as those of destructive impulses directed against a loved object, or even, as will be seen in later sessions, of anxieties relating to internal dangers and persecution by dead and hostile objects, can yet lead to great relief. I discovered that progress in analysis was bound up with interpreting whatever anxieties were most acute, whether they were of a psychotic nature or not, unquote. Session 24 on a Saturday. Do you know what I think? How can you really know? These are Richard's words. Mrs. Klein's interpretation called upon Richard's anxiety and his doubts over their work. At a certain point, his doubts appeared as anxiety's punctuation. However, doubts may also function as a challenge to internal and external scenes of authority. Until Richard could question his thoughts, affect remained split off from their symbolization. The capacity for doubt, as the analyst Marion Milner described in a 1942 lecture given to the Institute of Education in London, begins with an awareness of the relation between inner and outer reality, with the idea that, quote, Miller says, thoughts are different than things. The child, as well as the adult, has to learn to doubt magical beliefs and disillusion, not only the illusion of what feels like absolute knowledge. External authority, such as the school, must also be rendered as human and as capable of being questioned. In the psychoanalytic situation, doubts serve another purpose. The analyst is not omnipotent, only a participant with congealed feelings that chime in with the insistence that drifting thoughts release an overabundance of feelings. So one of the large issues that became the work is how and why the analyst disillusions her seeming omnipotence or breaks open the fantasy that minds can be read and controlled. Technique itself cannot be omnipotent. There must be an eye towards freedom as well as an address to the paranoid anxiety that stops it short. Indeed, the other cannot know too well, and uncertainty over meaning is as much an operation of language as it is a quality of affect. The doubts begin with the question, is it really true, or how can you know? Miller's open question turns to feelings terminable and interminable. This is Milner, quote, how far does it help the child to realize the inner reality as process, if this recognition does, in fact, require the ability to tolerate doubt and a willingness to wait in uncertainty, unquote. From Klein's view, thinking itself would become a container for mental pain, a waiting mechanism, and an avenue to narrative. Their 24th session occurs on a Saturday when Richard begins with his doubts and what they can mean for Klein. He is drawing a picture, one of the Starfish series, where each arm represents a mummy, bad daddy, Mrs. K, brute Hitler, and the Empire. As he colors in the arms, he is singing marching songs. Richard is worried about the invasion and whether Mrs. K would still be able to see him. The drawing was one of attack and destruction, and Richard did not believe he harbored bad feelings towards his parents. He stopped and asked Mrs. K, do I really think of this? Do I really think all of this? I don't know if I do. How can you really know what I think? Unquote. How anyone can know anything expresses a feeling. Mrs. K, in third-person voice, then acknowledged his relations to his doubts, quote, from his fantasy drawings and what he was saying and doing, she gathered some of his unconscious thoughts, but he had just expressed his doubts about whether she was right and could be trusted, unquote. Klein related these feelings of mistrust to his worries about his mother, and also that Mrs. K would give Richard to Mr. K, whom he thought was the enemy. Recently, Klein added as an aside, quote, he had unconsciously expressed death wishes towards Mummy and Mrs. K, and found it very painful and frightening when Mrs. K interpreted this. It seemed that he had experienced both trust and distrust more strongly, unquote. It is Richard's double attitude that Klein held close when Richard demanded, quote, was Mrs. Klein a foreigner or not, unquote. Just as they were ready to take a break for the weekend, Richard seemed more relaxed. Klein noted Richard's affection, quote, turning off the electric fire, he said, poor old radiator will have a rest, unquote. Richard wanted to make sure Mrs. K would bring his drawings back next time. Then, looking over the room, he said, quote, poor old room, so silent. Then he asked Mrs. K what she was going to do over the weekend, unquote. Klein's last interpretation drew the personification of the room into a personal narrative of reparation, quote, Mrs. Klein interpreted his fear that she might die at the weekend, the poor old silent room. That was why he had to make sure about bringing the drawings. This also expressed his wish to help in the analysis and thus put Mrs. K right and preserve her. This was why he wished for Mrs. K, the poor old radiator, to have a rest and not to be exhausted by her patients, particularly by him, unquote. Klein's note on this session attended to the mechanisms of denial as a way of dealing with anxiety, quote, in this instance, the internal danger situation consisted of the good mother being attacked and destroyed by his hatred and gave rise to depression and despair, unquote. As Richard's anxiety diminished, he could face the external world as more than a delegate to his hostile feelings. The next session, Sunday, 52nd session, do psychoanalysts go to church? This was Richard's question. Mrs. K and Richard met for a Sunday session. Richard is most curious about what Mrs. Klein does when she is not with him. The session turns to Richard wondering about Klein's belief in God and country. Then, while drawing a German airplane on the ground hit by lightning, asked if he could raise something personal. Quote, did she go to church? Do psychoanalysts go to church? And at once, even before Mrs. K could have replied, he said that she could not go because she was too busy, unquote. Mrs. Klein opened his question through what he did not ask. Did Richard think it was wrong not to go to church? Then, quote, Mrs. K asked if he was afraid of punishment by God, unquote. Richard changed the topic by announcing that he wished to give a performance with a rope that he swung between his legs and told Mrs. Klein to be the audience and clap enthusiastically. The play became manic, and then Richard asked Mrs. K to perform with the rope. She too swung it around. Quote, Mrs. K then interpreted that when Richard held the rope between his legs, it represented Daddy's genital, which Richard had taken away and now possessed. Mrs. K performing with the rope meant that Mummy too should have a powerful penis, which would make them all equal. The rope play, both Richard's and Mrs. K's, expressed his wish to have sexual intercourse with her, at the same time that this was a wish he had been so afraid of and for which he felt that God, standing for Daddy, would punish him, unquote. Richard kept returning to his drawing of the downed plane, the blackening sky. He then walked around the room aimlessly, and Mrs. K told him he wished to escape from his bad thoughts. This last turn was to his urgent dilemma. Richard felt it was wrong that they met on Sunday. Moreover, he had severe doubts about psychoanalysis and felt it too was wrong. The sexual talk was improper, though Richard did have the dangerous wish to have sex with Mummy. But it was improper of Mrs. K to speak of such desires as they were tempting him. It is worth quoting the range of emotional experiences involved in such a quick exchange. Quote, this is Klein, these desires seemed all the more dangerous to him because they were connected with hate, jealousy, and destruction of his parents, whom he loved. He had always been struggling to get away from such hostile feelings, which he felt were bad, and wished only to experience love. But Mrs. K, when he was afraid of her tempting him, represented Mummy as well, who was tempting him by allowing him to sleep in a room alone with her. He also suspected her, whenever she showed him love, of being disloyal to Daddy and of encouraging Richard's bad and hostile desires. He felt Mrs. K should not have given him this session on Sunday, that she and he should have gone to church. At the same time, he did want Mrs. K to give him an additional session, unquote. It's at this point that Richard told Klein that he felt the analysis was helpful. What changed his judgment? In Klein's view, putting into words the distorter of painful clashing feelings provided Richard with a means to symbolize anxiety and ambivalence. When bad things can be put into words, the authority of fantasies diminish. The analytic dialogue was now deep in the heart of Richard's worries, though when they walked out together into the world, Richard turned back to the playroom and said it was good for the playroom to have a rest. Here we can summarize Klein's play technique. She listens to the child's despaired utterances and sees in his drawings depressive pain and his hopes. She observes Richard's walkabouts as eruptions of anxiety, promoting the defense of denial of any meaning unconscious communication holds in store. And she works from inside Richard's questions. Technically, Klein's interpretations are meant to call forth both anxiety and new ideas. Richard's activities, drawings, doubts, questions, and refusals become an index of his emotional attitude towards his inner world, his transference to Klein, and what he cannot bear to imagine about the outer world. Paradoxically, the mechanisms of defense, omnipotence, identification, and splitting, carry the means to know them. Klein is then proposing a new kind of psychological knowledge capable of containing inchoate elements of the emotional world and the moral quandaries involved. Then, too, the unconscious communication Klein conveyed between the lines of interpretation belong to their friendship. But the analyst must be willing to be a magnet for love and hate, become the poor radiator, the sad, silent, empty room, and then the playroom that needs a rest. The next session, must we say goodbye? The sadness of parting. The last sessions were those of parting as much as they were an inquiry into the sways of security and insecurity. Klein felt that Richard's manifest wish was to end his analysis in a friendly way. There were, however, new pains, headaches, tummy aches, and demands that Mrs. K leave her other patients and work only with him. His distrust of Klein resurfaced in the form of doubts over her and his goodness. Richard is manically drawing pictures and tearing them up. In session 75, Richard asked Mrs. Klein, could she cure dopey boys? He also wanted to know when she became a psychoanalyst. Was it before or after she married Mr. K? Was Mrs. K loyal to the German enemy? Then he asked whether Mrs. K really did not mind his referring to her nationality. Has Richard's questions hurt Mrs. K's feelings? In their 83rd session, his feelings of persecution and resentment returned, and Klein's note acknowledges Richard's loss. And he gave me the feeling that he had regressed to the attempts of young children who are unable to draw a complete figure for complex reasons such as lack of skill, lack of integration, and feelings of guilt about having torn to bits the mother's breast and the mother. The regression to earlier attacks of tearing, biting up, and the corresponding persecutory anxieties were therefore used in order to get away from depression and despair. I have pointed out, Klein continues, generally speaking, that the incapacity to cope with the depressive position often leads to a regression to the earlier paranoid schizoid one, unquote. The dopey boy question returned in session 92 when he asked whether Mrs. K was, quote, a doctor for the mind as other doctors are for the body. Then, quote, Richard said that the mind was even more important than the body, though he thought that the nose was very important too. Klein's interpretation returned to his worries over the insides of his body and whether Mrs. K could be a helpful figure. Quote, the nose that also stood for Richard's genital, and that he was afraid that something was wrong with it, that it was damaged and would not develop properly. And this was the reason why he was afraid of becoming a dunce. He doubted whether Mrs. K could actually cure the genital as well as the mind, unquote. Everything stands for something else and threatens to collapse meaning. Bad objects threaten to destroy good ones. Richard seems to be asking, what can Klein really do for him? And in their last three sessions, the large question of whether in the sorrow of parting, everything good would disappear forever. In their last session, Richard wished to caress, kiss, and hold Mrs. K, and agreed that touching her was his way to keep her inside him. He was afraid he could not keep her, but had hopes that he could. Klein's last comment concerns Richard's worries of parting and his wish to preserve the good object. Quote, Richard's mood during this was much like that of the 90th session with much unhappiness and tension. His increased desire to be cuddled showed repeatedly in his touching Mrs. K, and he dropped things so as to be able to touch her legs when picking them up. He was obviously all the time trying to restrain his aggressiveness because of the fear of injuring his loved objects, unquote. It seems all along that Richard was desperate to keep in mind good objects and deeply worried that just as the world was being ruined by war, he too would destroy his capacity for love and friendship. But now there are at least two Mrs. K's. His psychoanalyst he wished to kiss, who played with him and accompanied his troubles, and because of their work he was determined to keep her alive, and the internal Mrs. K, who witnessed the comings and goings of the emotional world. Klein considers then the fate of the good object and the glimmers of the depressive position there all along, quote, the growing predominance of the life instinct and the fusion between the two instincts and the ensuing mitigation of hate by love were the ultimate reason why he could remain hopeful in spite of the very painful experience of breaking off an analysis which he consciously and unconsciously knew to be essential to him, unquote. Klein insisted that only by addressing anxiety, calling it forth, and giving affects a story of embodiment to aid the freedom of dispersal, would the child invest in the life world of the mind needed to create emotional bonds. But we also learned that children too not only create the analysts they can bear, but are also analysts in the making. Such an important tie to the transference dialogue affects both the course of psychoanalysis and Klein's working style. In contemporary terms, Kristeva's figure of the inexpressible child caught between biology and meaning provides a fine description of the child and analyst at work. Quote, this is Kristeva, the therapist's task is twofold. First, the therapist must be an analyst who fosters desire, including, of course, the desire to speak, despite inhibition and depression. Second, the therapist must be a speech therapist who maps out individual program for each child, since theoretical givens do not apply to everyone, and then helps those children understand the linguistic categories that will allow them to add symbolic productions to their subjectivity, unquote. Klein's principle for affecting psychoanalysis may go something like this. Where deprivation was, there frustration, aggression, fantasy, anxiety, defense, depression, gratitude, reparation, and friendship shall become. Step by step and side by side, human tolerance and mental freedom walk hand in hand. And Klein insists upon narrative, now as negative capacity, as our first resource for working through the schizoid defenses and their denial of the relational infantile roots of the emotional world. Yet we need these anxieties. So narrative, like the desire for love and friendship, as we have seen in many of their sessions, is a double-edged sword. The words themselves can be mistaken for taunting objects. They may also become a symbolic scaffold for new thoughts. Klein was well aware that her vocabulary would be shocking to her readers. At the start of an elaborate index for the Richard case, Klein writes an unusual prefatory note. This book is written in 3 distinct languages. The first expresses the child's material in concrete everyday terms and the symbolic meanings. The second, the chapter notes, is written in the terms of an ordinary psychoanalytic book or paper. And third, however, seldom appears in the index, and when it does, it's usually for the purpose of illustrating chapter notes. But how daunting it is to index the effusions of psychical reality. See under babies, babies, baby. See also children, chicks, eggs, fish, flies, sailors, salmon, par, seed, starfish, birth of, desire for, desire to be, desire to give mother, desire for mother to have, desire to restore mothers, to restore mother, fear of children as, greedy, hostile, internal, inside mother, attacked and dead, inside mother, fear of, mixed feelings about, shared with mother. See under babies. Only in the index do we rush into the difficulties of distinguishing the 3 registers of psychoanalysis: affect, fantasy, and technique. In postscript, Richard's recollection of the analysis. Many people wonder what happened to Richard. Klein reported some news that he returned to school, though she knew there was no way to forecast the afterwardness of endings. Richard appears briefly in another book, Philip Grothkurth, a biographer of Klein, somehow found the adult Richard 40 years later. Grothkurth reported on their 3 meetings. In their first encounter, Grothkurth faced a 50-year-old man who did not know of Klein's study and of course did not respond to the name Richard. But he did remember Mrs. Klein and recollected the toys, the analytic room, and the bus he traveled on, his fear of other children, the kisses he wanted to give her, and then his temper. Still active, he admitted. In the second meeting, Grothkurth gave him a copy of Narrative of a Child Analysis. She describes Richard holding the book. He glanced at the photograph of Melanie Klein on the back cover. "Dear old Melanie," he murmured. Then he suddenly put the photograph to his lips and kissed it affectionately. It was the third meeting after he had read the narrative that Richard expressed what his analysis felt like. Quote, "The adagio from Mahler's Fifth Symphony more perfectly than any words I could use sums up the complete truth of my feelings at that time." Gustav Mahler's Fifth Symphony was written between 1901 and 1902. He had fallen in love with Alma Schindler. With music, he created what Jen Malt Fisher described as, quote, "a vocabulary that seems familiar and sometimes even intimately colloquial." Mahler expresses all that is unheard of and uncanny, all that is unsettling and upsetting. What sounds alien, what it was alien sounds familiar, and what is familiar now seems alien, unquote. The Fifth Symphony is a vast stormy sea of the soundings of the drive to reach the elusive depths of emotional life. Some musical commentators have described the opening of the symphony, known as the funeral march, as hysterical. Crying horns, loud blasts that insist upon their hearing. It is difficult to listen without feeling anxiety. Is that first movement an ode to the past or a foreshadowing of a future of war? The second movement, too, is stormy, and Mahler directed it to play with vengeance. The scherzo is a frenzied dance that Mahler described as both giving and destroying birth. The fourth movement, the adagio, is best known through Visconti's film of Thomas Mann's novella of the artist's crisis with love and art, Death in Venice. It goes right to the depths and is to be played with excruciating slowness. Fisher describes this movement as one of love and elation. And what to do with all that poignancy? How shall it end? The fifth movement cannot give an answer, only a compromise that Fisher noted, quote, as a papering over of the cracks opened by the first 4 movements. It is as if Mahler's symphony understood the pain of integration is never complete. As for the psychoanalytic situation, it too plays with the movements of vengeance, anxiety, love, and compromise that taken together freely associate with the grand psychical themes of friendship. Klein provides a new vocabulary that is utterly familiar and estranging. Such words may bear the weight of a multitude of object relations and open the art of compromise, symptoms, weaning, the psychoanalytic situation, the transference, the endings, the pain of incompleteness, a measure of resignation, and still the reparative urge for narrative. All express the flux of emotional attitudes towards someone or something. Klein also teaches us that the self, as everything good and bad, is also a papering over of cracks. Fantasy will be our best and most fragile threading. Narrating the fate of depressive anxiety will be our lot. But so too will be the wonders of an unrepeatable friendship that can bear the question of hope for a moral psychology dedicated to the good object, whatever that may be. Klein's parting gesture would come as her last book. It would remind a 50-year-old Richard of those long ago yearnings of love and loss that return with great poignancy of looking back. His parting gesture in receiving their book is to seal his friendship with a kiss. Thank you.